the 19th century, the McGuffey Reader was everywhere, and that's what all kids used to read. And in it, it had the Washington cherry tree story. And so I'm going to go through the cherry tree story for you, in case you don't know it. So George moves here with his family when they're 6 years old, and it's a farm that has a lot of different crops, and one of them is fruit trees, in particular cherry trees. And so George's father gives him a little hatchet and says, okay, you're old enough now, you can have a hatchet. And George takes this hatchet out and barks, which is a polite word for chop, one of his father's favorite cherry trees. And then Dad, Augustine Washington, came and sees the tree's been chopped, does the math, knows who has a new hatchet, and goes up to George and says, did you bark my tree? And George told the truth. And the dad was so happy. This is where the story starts to wander a little bit from reality, because as a father, I would tell you, it would make me happy if my child told the truth, but it wouldn't mean that I would praise them after chopping my favorite tree. I still think there's a punishment out there somewhere. But anyway, so George's father is so happy that he told the truth that he heaps praise on George and doesn't punish him. And so that's story number one. There is no evidence to support or deny that story. It's just it just sort of exists out there. It's a very famous one. The second most famous myth about young George Washington is the stone throw story, and that's the one we're going to talk about mostly today. And so the story is that George Washington threw a stone the size of a silver dollar. Now that little bit gets dropped off, right? It's when people shorten that story, they say he threw a silver dollar across the Rappahannock, not the Potomac. The Potomac's very, very wide. You can't get it across at Mount Vernon. When he's here, you can get it across here. And you say, well, how wide was this river in the 18th century? And we would say, we have no idea. Because in the 1870s, the Corps of Engineers, 150 years ago, does everybody know what the Corps of Engineers? They're engineers that work for the Army, came and they built walls, wooden walls, and you can see one if you go over. You can see that wooden wall in low tide, and it's low enough tide now that you can actually see it. And then they scooped the dirt out in the middle to make it go faster and deeper, and dumped it on this side. And so it goes, you see that little rise on the other side of the bench? That's the old width of the river in this particular spot in the 1870s. Before that, it was on this side, but we don't know how far this side went. We have no, because it's been altered, we have no idea. And so the idea is that George would have stood here and thrown a rock across the river, and that's a big throw. And what's interesting about George Washington, or one of the things that's interesting about George Washington, is there are a lot of stories about him throwing for his entire life. So my favorite one is he's a general in the Army. They're in the middle of the war. They've just had a bad day. They're retreating. The whole army is sort of pulling out and going, sort of retreating backwards. And he comes across these two drummer boys who are throwing rocks in the river. And George stops, gets off his horse, and says, here, let me show you how to do that. I'm really good at throwing. And he teaches them how to throw rocks. There's another story later when he's at Mount Vernon. There's a bunch of guys hanging around some sort of party, and they're throwing horseshoes to see who could throw it the farthest. And he comes up and he goes, what you doing? And they said, well, we're throwing these horseshoes. He says, well, let me try. And he wings one way past everybody else. And he goes, if anybody else gets close to that, come call me and I'll come throw another one. He loves to throw. And so I like this story a lot. and I'm thinking that it is true.